Magune nasu. I'm Space Dirt, and this is my first ever Conlang showcase. This Conlang, which I have dubbed Laghama, is my first real attempt at something naturalistic. In universe, Laghama is an isolate spoken in the southern part of the archipelago, and is the majority language thereof. Laghama-speaking culture is deeply conservative in many ways, including linguistically. Being able to speak the so-called proper Laghama is seen as integral in realizing one's potential. Now, on to the actual language. The first thing to be covered here is the phonetic inventory, which is rather small, straightforward, and doesn't feature anything particularly exotic, except for maybe the uvular stops and the lack of ul. Modern Laghama's already simple inventory actually increased in complexity as it evolved from the proto-language, which featured no phonemic obstruents at all, and vowels also had no length distinction. Overall, though, it has remained much the same over quite a long period of time. The syllable structure went through a similar transformation. Although it started as a purely CV language, Laghama eventually evolved into a CVC language, with a few constraints on allowed clusters. Although Laghama's sound changes were rather minimal, it does still possess a few fun phonological quirks, my personal favorite of which arose due to quantitative metathesis, which is one of Laghama's more notable sound changes. In this case, geminate consonants have their length passed onto the preceding vowel, which can create some fun alternations. For example, in many words, the suffixing of the definite article caused this change, which eventually led to definiteness being conveyed only by vowel length if the word ended with the same vowel as the definite article. Laghama is written in its own script, which originally developed as a sort of household display system. Professions were very important to the Laghama people. Therefore, they decided to carve glyphs into stone outside of their dwellings to communicate to others what they did, who lived there, and what they had. And widespread use eventually led to a logography developing. The system eventually spread and was used for some other writings, but the household identifiers remained the most popular use. A papyrus-like substance was eventually developed, which allowed more records to be kept, the need of which was ever increasing. And finally, the script made a full transition to being written on this papyrus substance with a reed pen and ink. Along the way, the logography transitioned into a syllabary, and due to its main use as a household identifier, glyphs related to household concepts became syllable characters. Due to the conservative nature of the people, though, spelling was kept largely the same as when the system was first introduced. Due to the lack of sound changes, though, the historical spelling isn't too bad, though the system is also written with no punctuation, so that makes things a little difficult as well. Now, moving on to grammar. Starting with syntax, Laghama is mostly head final, with a default word order of SOV. There are a couple things that prevent it from being totally head final, though. For example, adjectives come after nouns, rather than the opposite. This feature evolved even before the proto-lang, as adjectives used to be stative verbs, but then became dedicated adjectives that couldn't occur without a copula. This also explains why these adjectives are uninflected, as verbs are also uninflected. In addition, possessors come after possessees, so it still does have a couple odd syntactical things, though it is mostly head final. In terms of nouns, they're inflected slightly more than in the proto-language, and are marked for number, case, definiteness, and sort of gender. Starting with sort of gender, as that may be a little confusing on its own, Laghama lacks grammatical gender in the truest sense. However, there is a gender marking that is applied to animate nouns. What happened is before the proto-language, there was a system of gender that was divided into animate and inanimate, and animate could be further subdivided into masculine and feminine. As the language evolved, gender was lost, and these gender-signifying morphemes that only indicate physical sex are now just placed on living nouns. These are also placed on plurals, but only if the group is homogeneously one gender. Otherwise, the plain plural marking is used. Speaking of plurals, number marking generally works the way one would expect, with a suffix applied to nouns that goes after the gender suffix. A similar thing applies to the definite article, which due to sound changes has become a little more obscure than the plural typically is. One notable thing, though, is that there was an old dual number that was only preserved in the first person. Otherwise, it's only singular and plural. Through its evolution, Laghama developed a relatively simple case system from suffixed postpositions. It has 4 cases. First is the nominative, which is used for marking the subject and most postpositional arguments. Then, the accusative is used for marking the direct object and evolved from a direct object marker, as one might expect. The dative evolved from a postposition meaning to and functions as an indirect object marker and a sort of allative case. Finally, the genitive evolved from a postposition meaning from or of and marks possessors and functions as a sort of ablative case as well, forming a nice pair with the dative. For these two cases, new postpositions evolved that have the noun take either of those cases, and they evolved from verbs to add more specific meanings. In addition, the dative is also used for certain verbs of experience. Moving on to verbs, they have a relatively low degree of inflection since most role marking is done on nouns. Proto-Laghama distinguished perfective and imperfective aspects, as well as a past and non-past tense. However, the modern language now has a future tense, and aspects are split along perfect and simple lines, with the perfective evolving into the perfect. The most used form of a verb is the simple present tense, which is the uninflected form that comes from the standard imperfective. This acts as the verb stem to which what used to be the perfective suffix can be applied. However, in many cases, this suffix has been obscured, and now two stems exist. Although this perfect stem isn't used on its own, it can be combined with the past auxiliary, which came from to have to create a past perfect. A similar thing can be done with a simple stem to create a general past. One thing to note is that the past perfect is still used as a preterite in interrupted actions. To form the future, a word meaning in order to was suffixed to the lexical verb, and the verb kheba, meaning to go, was used as an auxiliary. This creates an uninflected future form of the verb. And other necessary marking is marked on the auxiliary. The passive voice is marked with another verb suffix, creating a separate simple and perfect passive stem. And modal information is conveyed through the use of particles that come after verbs or adverbial phrases. Laghama also makes heavy use of action nominals. These were originally formed by adding the definite article to the verb, but sound changes have obscured it a little. These are used not only for normal gerund-related stuff, but also for abilitative and assessive constructions. Arguments of these verbs are put in the genitive case unless they would take a case other than the nominative or accusative. For example, to say, I need to eat it, you would say, amu koine amu yukuyu sidi, which can be translated as, I need my eating of it, or something similar. The first argument is understood to be the subject due to word order, and in most cases both arguments need to be explicitly stated like this. The one exception is abilitatives. For example, I can see the stars would be amu seineni ati muchayufecha, which translates to, I have the seeing of the stars. In this case, though, overtly stating the subject isn't necessary, as it is understood that the subject is the same for both, which is not always true in other cases. Thus, stating the subject here is considered ungrammatical. So that's just a little look at Laghama and how it works. To end this, I'd like to provide a spoken sample of Laghama. I just want to excuse my poor technique in speaking it. I'm not very good, I will admit that out front, but this is my best attempt at telling the Laghama creation story. Yagube ego, faladebe efesucha mechili ei, lalumeli, kele elenicha kufisi kefke uke mechi Magu eo, luge ese yagge mui, elenicha nifsufese esne une Suuhati ydikulunna iqa eqaaquli ibukuha anisamuqa unasha eshu Lyhsaha kuhaju iska kuha eshu lalumeline yigi esi faladabeine aela esi kuudi kuhaju faladabeike tufsu ulafa esi kuha lethane ikso Ati muha akuyeine eshi me eyu eune esi kuha eshu maike idi ata ika qeba esene u sacha Imi fida kuha esine supshe eha kuha kuhayu kheli yusko mahi esi kuha satine faladebe lifi esi eleu meine ye puduyu Kela elenicha ayaqine kufisi fecha une Deluchi kului kudiu aeleine kefki kayu une esi suha esi anisacha Esfeine letrayuma pipi que una shaune. Anyway, that's all for today. I apologize again for me probably sounding not the most comfortable speaking my own Conlang, but you know how it is. Anyway, that's all for today. This has been Space Dirt, and thanks for watching.